This is from Genesis chapter 32. Jacob went on his way, and the angels of God met him. And when Jacob saw them, he said, "This is God's camp." So he called the name of that place Mahanaim. And Jacob sent messengers before him to Esau, his brother, in the land of Seir, the country of Edom, instructing them, "Thus you shall say to my lord Esau, 'Thus says your servant Jacob, I have sojourned with Laban and stayed until now. I have oxen, donkeys, flock, male servants, and female servants. I have sent to tell my lord in order that I may find favor in your sight.' And the messengers returned to Jacob, saying, 'We came to your brother Esau, and he is coming to meet you, and there are 400 men with him.' Then Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed. He divided the people who were with him and the flocks and herds and camels into 2 camps, thinking, 'If Esau comes to the one camp and attacks it, then the camp that is left will escape.' And Jacob said, 'O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who said to me, return to your country and to your kindred that I may do you good. I am not worthy of the least of all the deeds of steadfast love and all the faithfulness that you have shown to your servant. For with only my staff I have crossed this Jordan, and now I have become 2 camps. Please deliver me from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, that he may come and attack me, the mothers with the children. But you said, I will surely do you good and make you offspring as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude.' So he stayed there that night, and from what he had with him, he took a present for his brother Esau, 200 female goats and 20 male goats, 200 ewes and 20 rams, 30 milking camels and their calves, 40 cows and 10 bulls, 20 female donkeys and 10 male donkeys. These he handed over to his servants, every drove by itself, and said to his servants, 'Pass on ahead of me, and put a space between drove and drove.' He instructed the first, 'When Esau my brother meets you and asks you, to whom do you belong? Where are you going, and whose are these ahead of you? Then you shall say, they belong to your servant Jacob. They are a present sent to my lord Esau, and moreover he is behind us.' He likewise instructed the second and the third and all who followed the droves. 'You shall say the same thing to Esau when you find him, and you shall say, moreover your servant Jacob is behind us.' For he thought, I may appease him with the present that goes ahead of me, and afterward I shall see his face. Perhaps he will accept me.' So the present passed on ahead of him, and he himself stayed that night in the camp."
Okay, we're picking up in verse 22. "The same night he arose and took his wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream and everything else that he had. And Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, 'Let me go, for the day has broken.' But Jacob said, I will not let go unless you bless me. And he said to him, 'What is your name?' And he said, 'Jacob.' Then he said, 'You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed.' Then Jacob asked him, 'Please tell me your name.' But he said, 'Why is it that you ask my name?' And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, saying, 'For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered.' The sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel, limping because of his hip. Therefore to this day the people of Israel do not eat the sinew at the thigh that is on the hip socket, because he touched the socket of Jacob's hip on the sinew of the thigh."
We are going to finish by reading the entirety of chapter 33. "And Jacob lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, Esau was coming, and 400 men with him. So he divided the children among Leah and Rachel and the 2 female servants. And he put the servants with their children in front, then Leah with her children, and Rachel and Joseph last of all. He himself went on before them, bowing himself to the ground 7 times until he came near to his brother. But Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. And when Esau lifted up his eyes and saw the women and children, he said, 'Who are these with you?' Jacob said, 'The children whom God has graciously given your servant.' Then the servants drew near, they and their children, and bowed down. Leah likewise and her children drew near and bowed down, and last Joseph and Rachel drew near, and they bowed down. Esau said, 'What do you mean by all this company that I met?' Jacob answered, 'To find favor in the sight of my Lord.' But Esau said, I have enough, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself. Jacob said, No, please, if I have found favor in your sight, then accept my present from my hand. For I have seen your face, which is like seeing the face of God, and you have accepted me. Please accept my blessing that is brought to you, because God has dealt graciously with me, and because I have enough. Thus he urged him, and he took it. Then Esau said, Let us journey on our way, and I will go ahead of you. But Jacob said to him, My Lord knows that the children are frail, and that the nursing flocks and herds are a care to me. If they are driven hard for one day, all the flocks will die. Let my Lord pass on ahead of his servant, and I will lead on slowly, at the pace of the livestock that are ahead of me, and at the pace of the children, until I have came to my Lord and Seir. So Esau said, Let me leave you with some of the people who are with me. But he said, What need is there? Let me find favor in the sight of my Lord. So Esau returned that day on his way to Seir, but Jacob journeyed to Succoth and built himself a house and made booths for his livestock. Therefore the name of the place is called Succoth. And Jacob came safely to the city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan, on his way from Paddan Aram, and he camped before the city. And from the sons of Hamor, Shechem's father, he bought for 100 pieces of money the piece of land on which he had pitched his tent. There he erected an altar and called it El Elohe Israel. This is the very word of God.
Well, the two chapters that we just read, thank you, readers, tell us about Jacob's journey back home to Canaan. Before that journey can be complete, there's one little matter that has to be resolved. When Jacob left home 2 decades earlier, he left in fear for his life. His brother Esau had determined to kill him, angry because of how Jacob had tricked and deceived him not once but twice, taking away his birthright and also his blessing. So now, as Jacob is on his way home, this is the one matter that is occupying his mind. The bitter anger and murderous plans of his brother Esau. What can Jacob do about it? How can Jacob ensure that his brother will not kill him when he gets home? So that's what these 2 chapters are about, right? And what are we supposed to take from it? As so often the narratives in the Bible invite us and welcome us into pondering, meditation. Perhaps there are all kinds of different things we could observe about this story. Undoubtedly, that's true. But one way that I think we could rightly analyze these 2 chapters is saying they are about forgiveness and reconciliation. But they're about forgiveness and reconciliation, not just on an individual level, which is how we almost always think about it. You've got somebody that's mad at you. You've got a broken relationship. We want to see it restored. They're also, these 2 chapters are also about forgiveness and reconciliation on a corporate level, as we shall see. And these 2 chapters tell us that in order for there to be forgiveness and reconciliation, both individually and also corporately, there has to be a radical change to our identity, to our name, to the very essence of who we are. Again, this radical change has to be true not just on an individual level, it has to be true on a corporate level. And again, it's hard for us to even imagine what that means, but the story will invite us in. So let's see this as we look through these 2 chapters and see Jacob first seeking forgiveness, securing forgiveness, and then experiencing it. Forgiveness sought, forgiveness secured, forgiveness experienced. So first, forgiveness sought. Jacob has just escaped from the wrath and anger of his uncle Laban. And now he has to confront the wrath, the anger of his brother Esau. Now, given what we've seen about Jacob and his life and his story up to this point, where he is pretty good at tricking and outmaneuvering his opponent, it's a bit of a surprise to see what he does here in these two chapters. He is genuinely seeking forgiveness. He wants real reconciliation with his brother. He's not content with simply outmaneuvering him, as he is apparently so skilled at doing. Jacob could choose to fight and defend himself against Esau, but instead, he seeks genuine forgiveness and reconciliation. Perhaps he's getting tired of living by the old way. Perhaps he's tired of a life of deceit and lies and trickery, and he thinks, I wonder if there's a better way to live. Wouldn't it be great if somehow there could be peaceful relationships between people without any hint of manipulation, deceit, fraud, and trickery? Wouldn't that be great if that were true, not just on an individual level, but between even larger groups of people and even between nations? So as Jacob neared the promised land, verse 1 says that the angels of God met him. Now, when Jacob had left his home 20 years earlier, he had a similar divine encounter, which also left him both encouraged and terrified. These two verses in chapter 32 have the same effect. Jacob senses here that God is with him. This is God's camp. So in other words, God is present. But this presence of God is both a comfort as well as cause for concern. To be on holy ground, as it were, means that, yes, God is with you. That's a comfort. But it also means that danger is lurking nearby. Darkness is right there. It's kind of like, maybe I imagined, being at a campfire in the desert late at night. The fire is a comfort, but you know, just a little bit further out in the darkness, there's coyotes and diamondback snakes. So in verse 3, Jacob sends his own messengers out into the darkness to see what's there. They come back in verse 6 with a report. Esau is on his way with 400 men. Now, even the number 400 is significant, it seems, because that number resembles, in other Old Testament stories, something of an initial strike force. So we are not surprised to read in verse 7 that Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed. He makes plans in verses 7 and 8 to make sure that if Esau attacks, at least some of his family will be able to escape. And yet the whole scene here, God's camp, God is present with us, has been set up with this sense of terror and fear. What will happen to Jacob if his brother attacks him, if forgiveness is not secured? But Jacob is not simply willing to hunker down and ready his defenses. He actually does something more. He goes on the offensive, we might say. He goes on the attack, and his weapon is a present. And what a present. Count it up. In verses 14 and 15, he prepares to offer Esau 550 animals from his livestock. This is no small gift that he offers to his brother. His intentions are made clear in verse 20 when he says this. And this is a key verse, so let's look at it. Perhaps, Jacob thinks, I may appease him with the present that goes ahead of me, and afterward I shall see his face. Perhaps he will accept me. Verse 20 is an important verse. It's difficult for us to see this in English because there's a deliberate wordplay that's going on in verse 20. 4 times in this verse, we find the Hebrew word for face. The last time we find it is when Jacob says, perhaps he will accept me. This is a regular Hebrew idiom for forgiveness. Perhaps he will accept me. So again, Jacob here is not resorting to his usual tactics of trickery and deceit. He sincerely longs for a reconciled relationship with his brother. He hopes here that he can appease him, he says, with his present. Now that can sound to us like a buy-off, right? Hush money, perhaps, or some kind of settlement that keeps one from having to admit guilt while also keeping the victim off one's back. But that's not what Jacob is doing here. That's not what's going on. Again, his desire is sincere. He genuinely wants a restored relationship with Esau. So, in other words, the way the story is told, this present that he offers to his brother is virtuous and commendable. Even the way that Jacob speaks to his brother through his messengers here in this chapter demonstrates the virtue of his offering. He calls Esau his Lord. He refers to himself as Esau's servant. Could his present, in fact, be understood as if he is in some way returning to Esau the blessing that he had stolen from him? At the very least, we can see that Jacob is restoring something of the benefits of the blessing that he had stolen from his brother. And the word for present in verses 13 to 21 is usually translated in the English Standard Version as an offering. An offering. It's what a subordinate brings to a superior to denote an attitude of homage and submission. It's a regular word that is found throughout Leviticus and Numbers for the kinds of offerings that would regularly be brought to God. It's the word used to describe what both Cain and Abel brought to God in Genesis chapter 4. And here we find Jacob offering it to Esau, clearly with the hopes that it will in some way appease, pacify any wrath that Esau still holds against his brother and prevents Esau from doing what Cain did to his brother Abel. Now, all of this can sound rather practical, right? You've got a broken relationship, you've got somebody mad at you, and you're trying to find a way to get on their good side or bring peace to the whole thing. But the way the story is told, and I've tried to alert this to us, the way the story is told here, this animosity that Jacob and Esau still have, the fear that Esau's going to come and attack his brother, this whole way it's told with the word appease in verse 20, which means literally to cover the face, by use of an offering, and thereby to cause a person to be favorable toward you. That whole process is often translated into our Bibles as to make atonement. Does that get your attention? This, by the way, is the first time that phrase or that word occurs other than the time it is used in Genesis 6:14. It literally means to cover. It's used for the kind of material that Noah uses when he's building the ark. So this is the first time it's found other than that time in Genesis 6:14. In other words, the whole way the story is told is with these religious tones that are going on here, indicating that Jacob's quest, his search for forgiveness with his brother, for reconciliation, for peace, is to be understood just as much as a quest or his search for forgiveness with God. In seeking to be reconciled with his brother, Jacob is essentially seeking to be reconciled with God himself, which is why if Jacob is going to come face to face with Esau, he first has to come face to face with God. So the center of these two chapters, the place where the way the narrator has told the story is directing our attention to the middle part. The center of these two chapters is this mysterious, strange account in verses 24 to 32. Now, you grew up, you've heard this story a lot of times, like, oh yeah, that's that story. This is a weird one, isn't it? This is a strange story. It is a terrifying scene, a fearful scene continues. Jacob is all alone at night. It sounds like how a movie would start, right? You're just like, here he is. And he struggles with a man until daybreak. Mark, that's quite a wrestling match when you think all night long. But when it's all said and done, it appears that the forgiveness Jacob sought has been secured. Somehow, through this all-night wrestling match, Jacob emerges forgiven. Forgiveness has been secured. Now, how do we approach this strange story here in Genesis 32, 22 to 32? The story is often spiritualized to describe the act of prayer. Have you ever heard that before? Praying is like wrestling with God, and that's what this story is all about. I don't think that's right, but it's not completely absent from the connection to prayer, as we'll see in just a moment. The story actually is told to us and is to be understood as a quite literal, physical entanglement. Here's Jacob all alone by himself, and then whammo, right? Out of nowhere. You can imagine this guy just jumps on him, and they're in a tangle. I'm sure Jacob must have initially thought that the man that he was wrestling with was his brother. But we come to learn along with him that this is some kind of divine encounter. That's what makes it really strange and mysterious. If this was Esau, we're like, well, of course, that's what we expect to happen. But the fact that this man appears to in some way be divine, God even, that's really strange. That's the reason why commentators and Christians for centuries have tried to allegorize it into some sort of all-night struggle of prayer. That makes more sense, perhaps, to us. But what would you expect the outcome of a literal physical wrestling match with God to be? And what would that even look like? How would you even look at the scene and imagine this literally playing out before our eyes? So even after all of these years of studying this story, analyzing the story, one commentator says this: the nature of the experience remains mysterious, as all encounters with God must necessarily be. Are you okay with that? Is it all right with you if we use the word mystery here and don't try to explain every detail or describe exactly what this looks like? You need to be okay with that because, not because, this is what Christians like to do, right? Is we're just going to try to avoid the difficult questions and punt. No, that's not why. It's not that we have to leave our questions at the door. The reason why we need to be okay with the mysterious nature of this is because although there is much about this story that we simply cannot explain, that's partly because those questions and those answers are just not the point of the story. When we read Jesus' parables, this is what often happens. We want to get into the weeds about, well, what did this mean? How did this exactly plan out? And you miss the whole point of the story. And what's the point of the story here? That's what we're after. This is ancient Hebrew narrative, right? That's the genre we're working with here. It's a distraction to try to read into all the elements of the story some particular meaning or significance. That might be interesting. We could have a fun discussion about those kinds of things, but we need to ask ourselves, where is the storyteller directing our attention here? We took these two chapters we're looking at today, and these two chapters, the storyteller, the narrator, is directing our attention to this episode. Okay, so here we are. We're looking at it. But even within this story, the way the story is written is directing our attention to the central part of this story. So here's one important clue. We've already noted that this story, again, the center point of the larger story, well, here's the central part of this smaller story within these two chapters. It's found in verses 27 to 30. It's the two name changes. This is why the story is told. This is the most important part of the story. If we get this, even if we're confused and don't understand all the other details, this is why the story has been told to us in the first place. So the two name changes is where we need to focus our attention. So here we see Jacob getting his name changed to Israel. Now that is incredibly significant. The Old Testament is the story of ancient Israel. And Jacob is not just the immediate ancestor to the ancient nation of Israel. He is that. But in light of this story, he is the very embodiment of that ancient nation. Here we are told the answer to the question, who is Israel? And the answer is not simply the biological descendants of Jacob. The answer is, the question is, who is Israel? And the answer is one who has striven with God and with men and has prevailed. That's who Israel is. Now, we have to remember, even in saying that the Bible isn't just telling us a story about some ancient nation. That's cool and that's interesting. Remember, God's promise is that through this nation, he will bring salvation to the world. It is through Israel that all of creation will be rescued from death and destruction. That's the great story. And it's with that in mind that we think of Israel prevailing as necessary to the hope for the world that the Bible offers. If Israel doesn't prevail, we are all doomed. And by the way, just in case we've confused on this point, I'll just reiterate what I said a minute ago. Who is Israel? It's not simply the biological descendants of Jacob. Even when you get to the New Testament, this will become a point of great contention. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay. So this is what this strange narrative in Jacob's life means, even if we can't satisfy all our questions about what actually happened. So if you think the story is clear enough about what happened, well, then just take it what it says. There's this, God is wrestling with Jacob. Okay, well then, here's what you should know. The word wrestled in verses 24 to 25 is found nowhere else in the Old Testament. It's the only place that we find it, 2 times. And the word itself, though it does refer to some sort of physical engagement, is a little bit ambiguous. It can refer to, of course, what we would think of a wrestling match, but it simply means to be entangled with another person. It can even be used for a hug. But the word itself is a deliberate wordplay. The Hebrew word wrestled sounds similar to the name Jacob. It also sounds similar to the name of the place where the whole thing occurs. This mysterious person, in other words, Jacob on the banks of the Jabbok.
Praise the Lord.
And what is the outcome? The mysterious man did not prevail against Jacob. Indeed, he concedes. This is the mystery. He concedes that Jacob has striven with God and with men and has prevailed. And so he changes his name to Israel. The name Israel means God fights. But the story is not so much about this one mysterious encounter, right? This story is emblematic of the great story that will unfold all throughout the pages of the Old Testament, indeed is waiting for its resolution in the New Testament. So here in this new name, something rather important is being communicated to us that we need to understand if we're going to understand the Bible. If we're going to understand words like salvation, and redemption, and even forgiveness and reconciliation. Whoever Israel may be, and that's a hotly debated topic throughout the Old Testament story, all the way into the New Testament perspective, and even to the modern day, to be sure. But to be Israel means to be intertwined with God. Now that's terrifying, just like we talked about Jacob being the chosen one. Do you want to be the chosen one? Do you want to be intertwined with God? But this struggle that we would probably be tempted to think of as Jacob wrestling against an enemy, oh, wait a minute. He doesn't struggle against God necessarily as though he were an enemy. It may feel like that at times, but there's more to this story. There's another name in the story, right? Jacob's wrestling partner has changed his name, and so Jacob says, well, what's your name? But the mysterious person won't say. His response, why is it that you ask my name, probably communicates to Jacob, you know who I am. No reason to answer. After all, once the mysterious person is gone, and again, we want to, did he just vanish? Like, as soon as he pops out and tangles and he's just gone, and we're facing that question, Jacob names the place Peniel, face of God. He seems to have understood that he was intertwined with God himself in one way or another. Don't ask me what that means. That's just what he understood this thing to be about. And he seems to have known that some point during the struggle because he refused to let go until he says, you bless me. Now, does that sound significant in the Genesis story? The blessing of Abraham in Genesis 12. This is the whole point of salvation. Going back a bit further, even in this story, we remember, we heard it read to us, Emily read this part, that Jacob had prayed for God to deliver him from what he feared would be his brother's murderous intentions. Remember that? Back in verses 9 to 12. We don't have time to look at them, but they're highly significant to this story. It is in that prayer that he appealed to God's promise to him to do you good. God had made this promise to do you good, make your offspring as the sand of the sea. That's the Abrahamic blessing. Abraham saying, God, you said you would do this. You promised that you would bring the blessing through me and through this family. So this story is not about Jacob wrestling with God in prayer. He's already done that. This story is the answer to that prayer. Verse 29 says it plainly, and there he blessed him. Jacob's response to the whole thing is, first, complete amazement that somehow he survived. I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered. Literally, he's alive, just like you. He's in his body, and he's alive. That's what he means by salvation and deliverance. It's what we should mean, by the way, by salvation. But how does he prevail? How will Israel prevail? Since his survival with Esau depends upon securing Esau's forgiveness, his survival with God depended on the same. Up to this point, Jacob has largely prevailed by his own schemes. But in his struggle with God, his tactics were useless. God simply touched his hip socket. And the Hebrew word is touched. It's not like, boom, big blow. He just touches him. Just a touch. And Jacob's hip socket is put out of joint, and he has to walk with a limp from this day forward. And yet, even in that struggle, Jacob is holding on, right? He won't let him go. He prevailed by holding on to God, refusing to let his wrestling partner go without the blessing. And the narrator concludes the story by telling us that it was because of this story that the people of ancient Israel did not eat, this is the NIV's translation, the tendon attached to the socket of the hip. Go ask our doctors exactly what that means. By the way, you're not going to find it in any of the Mosaic Code. This was not a legal legislation. This is simply something like a sacrament, almost like a memorial, a reminder of who Israel is, their identity. This mysterious episode is clearly one of those defining and life-changing moments, not just in the life of Jacob, but for Jacob emblematic of who Israel is. The whole thing takes place on the border of the Promised Land, returning back from exile, coming out of the Exodus. Like Pastor John showed us last week, those themes are all throughout the Jacob story, but also later in Israel's story, even later than the Exodus, in the returning from exile, which takes us all the way up to the 1st century when Jesus of Nazareth appears on the scene. It shows us that Israel will not prevail in their calling and election to be the mediators of God's salvation for the nations. They will not prevail apart from entanglement with God. And this struggle is a struggle they cannot win, but by holding on to God, they also cannot lose. The only way that salvation would come into the world would be by clinging to the blessing, grace, and power of God and letting go of the craftiness, wisdom, power, and deceit of men. So now that Jacob has secured the blessing of forgiveness with God, it is time for the blessing of forgiveness to be experienced with Esau. And it unfolds before us in chapter 33. Jacob lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, Esau was coming, and 400 men with him. Jacob layered his presents to Esau before, and now he layers his family, dividing them up by their mothers. But Jacob goes out in front of them all. Something's changed for him. He bowed 7 times, showing respect and submission to his brother until he came near to Esau. Gordon Wenham, Old Testament scholar, suggests that Jacob is doing here much more than showing respect. He's trying to undo the great act of deception whereby he cheated Esau of his blessing. If so, this is remarkable. Although he had received the forgiveness of God, he is not, we might say, content with that. Did you hear that? He didn't walk away from his encounter with God that long night and say, well, at least God has forgiven me. Who cares about this brother of mine who's angry? No. Not content. Forgiveness with God, most important. The foundation of everything. But forgiveness of God, this is the beginning point then of all of what Christianity offers to the world. You see, too many self-professed Christians today are simply content with forgiveness with God. One commentator calls this barcode Christianity. Here's what he says. The theology of Christian trinkets says there's something about the Christian that works like a barcode. You know, the barcodes that are on your groceries when you check out in your self-checkout line that you're looking for, those things, that's what he's talking about. In other words, some ritual, some belief, some association with a group affects God the way the barcode affects the scanner. Perhaps there has occurred a moment of mental assent to a creed or an association entered into with a church. God scans it and forgiveness floods forth. An appropriate amount of righteousness is shifted from Christ's account to our account into the bank of heaven, and all of our debts are paid. We are accordingly saved. Our guilt is erased. Who wouldn't want to be a Christian? Amen. Barcode Christianity. I'm with this commentator when he goes on to say this. The problem here is not, listen carefully, the problem here is not that salvation is not that free. Here's what he says. Grace is cheap from the point of view of those who need it. The problem is that the whole barcode arrangement tends to underestimate the intelligence and agility of our Father, who will not be tricked or cheated. We are the ones, listen, we are the ones who are in danger of missing the fullness of life that is offered to us. The kind of salvation that God is offering to us freely is not limited to what we might gain after death. God is eager to save us now, to offer to us real help in the real world and with our real lives. Is this what you really want? Or are you content with barcode Christianity? It's what Jacob wanted, and it's what he experienced in his reunification with his brother. The kind of forgiveness that is not less than our own moral standing with God, it's about so much more. In this particular case, the salvation that God is offering to Jacob is peace, but not just peace with God. That's the foundation. But also peace with other human beings like Esau, the one you tricked, the one you deceived. The story of salvation, brothers and sisters, is about that too. It's about peace with God. We usually get that part right, but we are willing to walk away from a face-to-face encounter with God and say, I guess that's it. The story of salvation is about so much more. It's about peace with God that brings peace to the world, even to brothers and sisters, neighbors, friends, family, spouses, even to our enemies. It's right for us as Christians then to hope for it and aim for it. The kind of experienced forgiveness and reconciliation with our neighbors like Jacob experiences right here with his brother. You know, Genesis 33, passage that Kayla read for us, it's a heartwarming encounter. It's like two brothers reconciled to each other. Gone. That's genuine forgiveness and reconciliation, isn't it? Genesis 33, right? I mean, there's no more deceitful schemes of Jacob. And if you say, well, what about that little bit at the end where he doesn't go to see her and all that? Okay, well, just get my manuscript and read footnote 17, and I'll tell you about that, all right? So if you're distracted by that, you can go look that up if that's interesting to you. Something had happened to Jacob right there when he was Jacobed on the Jabbok River. Something happened to him that brought different results to his encounter with his brother the next morning than he feared would be the case. On that lonely night, he wrestled with a man. The next day, he was embraced by his brother. The two episodes, the end of Genesis 32 and all throughout Genesis 33, are worth comparing, and they're worth pondering, especially in light of Jacob's words in verse 10. I have seen your face, which is like seeing the face of God, and you have accepted me. Brothers and sisters, if we have seen the face of God and survived, if God has forgiven us the weightiness of all of our sins that we've been talking about and singing about today, then that is your hope for your relationship with every other human being on the face of the earth. He has seen in the peace that he found with his brother a shadow, an echo of the peace he found with God the night before. But struggle is what it took to get there. That's how forgiveness comes. And all you have to do is remember the true Israel, the one left alone in a garden, Jesus of Nazareth, who struggled with God in a mysterious encounter in Gethsemane, the night he was betrayed. A limp. The whole encounter left Jesus of Nazareth sweating, as it were, great drops of blood. I'd take the limp. And the result the next day left him embracing a cross. It's that cross that marks the family of faith to this day. You've been reconciled to God like that, with that kind of struggle, then what do you think it will take for us to be reconciled with the world? For us to be agents, mediators of God's forgiveness and grace into his world. It's not going to come by our deceit, trickery, and power and might. It's going to come in the shape of a cross. It's the cross that is the means by which we prevail with God and with one another. Let's pray. So let us then, Lord, embrace a cross. Somehow we are meant to be marked just like the nation of Israel was marked by a limp, reminding of a great struggle that somehow mysteriously was actually a victory. This is how it is for us. A cross, which seems like the greatest of defeat, is actually the moment of great triumph. Not just offering us hope once we die. It does that. Of course it does that. But so much more. It is the blessing that the world is looking for. It is the hope, literally, of the world to keep us from destroying each other. So let us embrace a cross today. Once again, we come to a table to remember it's by a broken body and shed blood that forgiveness is found. Not just for us individually, yes, for that, for sure, but also the hope for the world. Remind us, let us remember today in Jesus' name, amen.